You probably won't have heard or have had any contact of any sort with the writer of our next story. Kit and I certainly have never met him.
No.
It actually, Rob, who, in agreeing to come on, be one of our step siblings on the Ultimate Horror Anthology, put himself in the firing line because we're now going to be discussing Rob's story, The 16th Step. And I have to confess as well, just to reiterate what Kit said about Rob being one of our greatest living short story writers, when we were saying, like, okay, we've got Rob on, what story are we going to choose? We were like scratching our heads. We were throwing loads of stories at each other because there are hundreds we could have chosen which would have had a place in the Ultimate Horror Anthology. So it was really difficult.
Thank you.
Really difficult choosing.
I was excited to see actually what you were going to choose because, of course, I had no idea. And I should say, are we recording now?
Yeah, we're going.
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember them. So what happens is I'll write a story and then I'm glad it's gone. And then years pass. And I know the titles vaguely, but I don't remember what they're attached to. So when Kit wrote to me and said, we're doing 16th Step, I thought, okay. And I think, well, obviously that's in We All Hear Stories, because that's the numbered ones.
Yeah.
16. It's the 16th story in it. But I honestly couldn't remember what it was about beyond the fact that it's about a staircase that has an extra step in the dark.
Well, we're going to remind you, it also appears in They Do the Same Things Different there, which is like one of your greatest hits.
Yes, right.
And I think the first time I encountered it when it was first published, which was in Johnny Mayne's anthology Burning Circus, which was put together for the British Fantasy Association.
Yes, that's right. I mean,
it's a great anthology.
It is, it's very good.
But yours was the best piece in it.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, it's...
No disrespect to the contributors, because it was a great anthology.
No, it was great, that. Yeah, it was nice to be invited. It's that funny thing that I get. I mean, I get commissioned for short stories for some of them, and that's fun. But for the majority of stories, I just write them, and then somebody will ask, oh, can we have a horror story? And I remember giving Johnny 16th Step, because I had already written it for my enormously silly book. Which is about numbers and things. So it was that funny thing that, you sometimes... I mean, because I write a lot of stories and they're not, I think, horror-related, I'm always aware that the horror ones I can at least sell on as well. So, 16th Step is... I remember vaguely writing it and quite enjoying it.
It's set... I kind of imagine it's almost like a period piece.
Yeah.
It's set sort of just post-war, I kind of get the feeling, in a northern... seaside town, probably somewhere like Morecambe, that's not quite Blackpool with the glamour of a pleasure beach. It's like a northern western Supermare style place in a boarding house, and it has one of the best opening lines is, was the house haunted? ? Probably not. Full stop. So we're dealing with a haunted house story, but right from the word go, you're being told it's not a haunted house, there's no hauntings and there's no ghosts.
Yeah.
And we then become aware of the fact that it's an unnamed narrator, female narrator, but she is never named throughout the whole piece, nor is the person to whom she's addressing the story.
I was just going to say, actually, Rob, if you do you want to do a reading of just the first...
Shall I read the very beginning of it?
That would be amazing, just to set the scene.
Just to give you the actual beginning premise. Was the house haunted? Probably not. But it certainly had some peculiar quirks, and Mrs. Gallagher always felt obliged to tell her guests about them. She'd warned those taking the box room that they might be able to hear weird whispering sounds in the night, but there was no doubt it was simply an effect of the wind coming in off the North Bay. Sometimes in the winter, the wind off the coast could be pretty fierce. There was a spot in the breakfast room, and she said, upon which if you stood for too long, you get a chill right down to your very marrow. I never found that spot, although I looked hard enough. I might have felt a chill in any number of different places, but never anything that touched my marrow even closely. And there was the staircase, and that was harder to explain. There were 15 steps leading upwards to the first floor, the first 9 straight up, the 10th curving around to the left as you ascended. They were covered with a thin shag carpet and supported by wooden banisters. 15 steps in all, but if you went downstairs in the dark, there at the bottom you would find a 16th. It only happened in the dark. If you put the lights on to count, there'd always be the 15 looking perfectly ordinary. If you took a candle downstairs with you, the 16th couldn't be found, and nor on nights when the moonlight was pouring in neither. But if it were pitch black, if when you looked down you couldn't see your feet or where they might be leading, then that extra step would be waiting for you, and only as you went downwards, never on the way up. It was a strange thing, but not especially unnerving. Mrs. Gallagher only told her guests of it so they wouldn't stumble, not so that they should feel spooked or scared, especially in the holiday season, she said, when the arcades were open late and the sea was warm enough for nighttime paddling. Guests might come back once she'd gone to bed. She didn't want anything waking her up if they tripped. They'd be fine if they went straight up to bed themselves, of course. It would be if they came down afterwards for a glass of water, say, that they might run into problems. You get guests trying it out, of course, especially the young ones, newlywed husbands trying to show off to their wives, squaddies on leave egging each other on. We could tell the sort. We could tell that first chance they'd get, they'd brave it for themselves. We were smart. We'd encourage them to get it out of the way on the first night. We'd do it before anyone had gone to bed so it wouldn't disturb. We'd turn out all the lights and pull the curtains and let them have their fun. Down they'd come, counting off the stairs as they did so, maybe laughing a bit, maybe trying to scare each other. They'd reach the 16th step, they'd laugh a bit more, they might even kick at it to make sure it was real. We'd give them a minute or two, and then they'd lose interest. We could turn the lights back on and get on with more important matters. It wasn't as if the extra step did anything once you found it. It was just a step, after all.
Okay. So, we'll give you a synopsis of the whole story in a few, but I've got to start with the genius of that premise, right? Just the setup, and also the fact that you lay it all out. Like, here we are at the very start of the story, and this is not a story where, you know, you're holding back the information, the discovery of the 16th Step. It's a known factor.
Yeah.
And you're just laying it all out for us in the first 2 pages. So talk me through, what's the thinking behind that in terms of the writing?
I quite like the effect I've discovered recently, because I did it again with something, and I thought, I'm doing that again, where I like to, with horrific or dissonant things, downplay them.
Right.
I like to try and explain that it's actually okay. I read a story recently in which a wife and her husband go to the funeral of her ex-husband, and then his new bride comes on, and wearing for the funeral his skin as a suit. Just that, and she's naked. And I describe it by saying it wasn't the whole body. I mean, we don't have the feet, so that was fine. And there was any blood, and we don't get all of the head, so it wasn't as if it was the whole body. And it's my way of. I think it's what people do. I think with really terrible things, you find a way of trying to make it better to begin with. So I wanted to tell a story where there was this dissonant thing that should be scary, and it becomes scary for reasons later. But I wanted it to be a reassuring thing. It's a quirk of the house. You get 16 steps. What always scared me as a kid was anything that was dissonant. I had a terrible fear and it was a weird fear that if I opened my curtains in my bedroom, there'd be a different number of trees.
Right.
That would scare me.
Right.
The trees wouldn't have to invade or kill me, or it wouldn't be like as a monster. It was about the idea of it would be different through that window to that window. That would freak me out. So the idea that I was trying to play with that and thinking I would be very upset by the idea that a staircase has an extra step that does nothing, but only in the dark. And I thought, well, let's just ride with that as a thing.
There's also that there is a sense of it almost being a seaside attraction as well. One of these cute little things that takes place that gives a boarding house a tiny bit of character, along with its hauntings. And so the way it's laid out at the beginning is almost as if you were reading this in a brochure or a TripAdvisor these days. Right up.
But it comes out, of course, out of an unreliable narrator who, as we learn, will always be trying to make the best of things and trying to smooth things over.
It's interesting. So, is she an unreliable narrator, or does she narrate unreliable facts? Because she talks about... we later discover that all the things that she's trying to write off such as the noises which you might hear and the tapping on the walls. That's just wind coming through and loose floorboards. And we learn actually there's a different reason behind this. But is she herself unreliable, do you think?
I think she's unreliable to herself.
Yeah.
So, I shan't spoil your description of it, but she's in an abusive marriage.
Yes.
And again, her introduction to her husband is saying, he wasn't a bad man.
He just did bad things.
But he also saying, it wasn't that scary. There was a 16th step. He wasn't a bad man because bad men don't... Because there was a good side to him. And once you actually realise that people start justifying, as they do, because it's a story really about domestic abuse.
Yes.
Once you start justifying things and finding excuses for the things, I think that she's actually a very, very reliable descriptor of what goes on. But you always want to try and paint what's happening, which you've accepted and you have stuck with.
Right.
Because the longer you stay, the more you feel that you're an idiot if you didn't complain before. So, yeah, I think that she's someone who constantly is lying about how bad the situation that she's in is in.
And can I also ask as well, just before we move on to the narrator, the other thing is just there are only two characters in the whole story that aren't ever named.
Yeah. And
that's the narrator and the person to whom she's narrating the story.
Yeah.
Was there a reason behind that choice, or was that just an instinctive thing?
I often do that. I feel that I really like people not knowing that they're tied down. If there's a first-person narrator, and especially in this instance, there's a very specific reason as well why the person who's being narrated to is listening to it.
Yeah.
And I think that once you start giving them a name, an identity, it stops being everybody who's reading it. Okay. And I really like the idea of... my big problem with short stories is I hate naming people. I'm not very good with names because I have aphantasia. I don't know at the moment what my wife looks like. I don't remember people's faces at all, or therefore I can't attach names to them very easily either. So when I'm writing a story, for me, it's kind of I rather like generally the fog of particularly if they're main characters, kind of keeping their identity a bit of a secret because that way it can be anybody. Okay. Once you start really nailing them down, I think that they become very, very crystallised. Which, of course, I think was important for Mrs. Gallagher in the story, but it isn't important for our narrator. It's better that gender apart, she could be me. She could be any of us.
Yeah. I think it's important for the husband to be named as well for the same reason.
Yeah.
And it's also that distancing. Yeah.
So, as you mentioned, she's come to this boarding house in the northwest of England with her husband, George, and she says he's not a bad man, he just did bad things. One of the bad things that they do is they turn up at boarding houses. He supposedly tries to find work, though he may be actually involved in other slightly more criminal enterprises, and then he does a moonlight flit. They run away and they don't pay the hotel, and he keeps justifying this to his wife, the narrator, by saying, as soon as I get a job, as soon as I get some money, I will come back, I will pay back all the people from whom we've borrowed this time, so I'm not stealing from you.
Right.
So he has a very elastic sense of morals.
Yeah.
Whereas she, it's quite patently obvious, has quite a rigid moral standard, except when it comes to her husband, and she keeps giving him too much leeway.
Yeah. I think there's a very telling line in that moment when actually she says, he always said, oh, we'll come back and we'll pay everybody back. And then there's a line where she says, I think he even meant that at the beginning.
Yeah.
So there is a sense that she understands him slightly better, maybe than he understands himself, or is less in denial, but she's still also very clearly got her own layers of denial about their relationship.
Yeah.
So I think there's a really interesting bit of nuance going on in the writing there where you get that kind of differentiation, psychological, if you like, differentiation. But yeah, anyway, so they're in there and they're staying in this place with the 16th Step, which is great. And then they have a confrontation, don't they? He thinks he's got a job as a fisherman because obviously they've made it to the coast, but that goes badly wrong. There's a sense he may have been humiliated, right? He may have got seasickness trying to go out, and there's this whole thing about you wouldn't like him when he's angry. Shock horror. He's not a very pleasant guy. So they decide to flit, right? They reach, there's a point where the landlady, this is important, the breakfasts, which is a great detail, where the landlady serves her up breakfast, but they ask for eggs, and she says, I'd like a poached egg, and he says, I'd like a fried egg, and she gets her poached egg, and he doesn't get any eggs. We're out of eggs. So the landlady takes against him straight away. She can read actually the whole situation, and she says to our narrator at one point, "You're in trouble." And she says, no, I'm not. She's sort of in denial about that. Anyway, they inevitably, after a confrontation, they decide to leave.
Just before they do that, one thing I would like to mention too is they try out on their first night.
Oh, yes.
The 16th Step.
Yeah.
And they go down in bare feet.
Yes.
And when they she gets onto the 16th Step, he feels it as carpeted, but the narrator feels the step as very, very, very cold. And then it stops being stone, it becomes almost like mud. Then it almost becomes fluid, as though she could sink into it, which is a brilliant piece of foreshadowing.
Yeah.
Won't say anything more. And because you don't overplay that at all, there's no shock horror, it's just a slight moment of unease.
I hope that you actually forget it. I hope that it's...
You kind of do because there's a lot of drama around it, and the landlady appears at the top of the stairs where they're kind of going, right, you've done that, okay, fair enough, back to bed. And the narrator feels slightly abashed by this, and George is a little bit more brazen. And it's apparent at that point the landlady Mrs. Gallagher takes very much against. Yeah. But she starts to warm to the narrator and asks her to call her Natalie, because she's French in origin, isn't she?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the inevitable happens, and they're sneaking off in the middle of the night, and the landlady catches them in the act of leaving. There's a wonderful moment where they're coming down the stairs, and our narrator realises she's lost count, and she doesn't know anymore where the 16th step is coming. But the light comes on before they get there, and it's the landlady. And she allows them to leave, but she does ask the narrator to stay, and the narrator does not stay. And there's a moment when we were in the narrator, she talks about this feeling of the 16th step approaching. She's not sure where it is. She doesn't want to cross it, because that means leaving this place, and something about that feels wrong. She actually wants to stay, but she can't, but she doesn't feel that she can. There's a responsibility to her husband. It's really what I love about that particular sequence. I love when form and function marry up so perfectly that you have something happening in the story that's really happening and is also very clearly a metaphor for something else that's going on. And it's actually kind of a perfect example of that as far as I'm concerned. The crossing of the 16th step in her mind, and how she both wants to do it, doesn't want to do it, and the reasons why. And of course it's symbolic of her understanding, her awakening of the unpleasantness of this relationship that she's got in. A sense for the first time there is actually a potential way out, but the fear of that, the fear of being able to cross that threshold. So needing to go across the 16th step, but also needing not to. Really just, it's a wonderful moment. Anyway, the landlady kicks them out. She does leave with her husband. And then very abruptly, she's coming back. And there's been an indeterminate amount of time has passed, and suddenly she's come back, and she's back in the town, and she finds the place where she stayed before, and she introduces herself back to Natalie, to the landlady. And then we learn what being in trouble means, because when she said she was in trouble, what she actually meant was that she's pregnant. And that's when we realise, I think that's the moment where we realise that the person who this story is being told to is the son, right? So that's when the narrator says, and I think that's the first time we realise who she's telling the story to. She says, I could stand that life for me, perhaps I deserved it, but not you. And then you realise, oh, okay, right. So that's that's kind of where the narrative pivots, right?
Yes. And from that point onwards, she leads an increasingly idyllic little life.
Yeah.
She learns the trade of bed and breakfasting. She knows it's extremely busy during the periods like July and August, a little bit of June. She gives up her own room at that point, and for the first time she has comfort and peace and security. And she also has in Natalie, as Mrs. Gallagher wants her to call her, a partner who supports her, and. It borders on being a romantic relationship, and it kind of hits that point where she says at several points it could have gone there, but it didn't.
Yeah.
And Natalie is everything that George wasn't. Not just that she's a woman, but she's thoughtful, she's kind, she's compassionate, she's caring. She does the things that she promises she will do, and even down to little things like, although she's a very big woman, she doesn't take up much space in the bed, and George used to thrash them out and constantly kick her, and she lies incredibly still. So that, and she's an incredibly good parent to the narrator's son, who is also not named.
Yeah, and it's a really moving moment. The other thing I think that's really important, though, the key moment that you kind of see in here is we get the impression that Mrs. Gallagher's husband was perhaps not dissimilar to our narrator's husband in terms of not, being a bit of a nasty piece of work.
Yeah, she says she's been let down by a man as well.
Yeah. And there's a sense there that, and she does say some things like, he did cook a really good fried breakfast. That was one of the few things he wasn't lying about, kind of thing. Because they met in the war, right? They met at the end of the... Yeah,
he told her he had property and she thought he was some sort of duke or great landowner.
That's right. Yeah.
Turns out he just owned a hotel.
Owned a bed and breakfast, yeah. But of course the inevitable happens. The husband returns and
That's quite scary, actually.
Oh, it's really scary. He wakes her up in the middle of the night with a hand over the mouth. And he's speaking very softly and very kindly, but when she finally sees him, he's clearly in a really ragged state. And there's this moment when she realises, and these are kind of her words, but she describes how he's clearly lost his pride. He's clearly let go of his pride. And that's the most terrifying thing of all to her, because so much of his sense of identity was bound up in that sense of pride. And that, whilst that was scary for her and difficult for her to navigate and sometimes would even lead to abuse, at least it gave her parameters within which she knew he was working. But now he's let that go.
Yeah.
Suddenly he could do anything. And it turns out he's carrying a knife. So he really could do anything. The landlady is awoken and he says, "We're going outside." And this is, Rob, one of the most chilling moments for me in the whole story is when the narrator says something like, "You can leave her behind," or "What are you going to do to us?" Or "What are you going to do to her?" Talking about Mrs. Gallagher. And he says, "I don't know." And the way he says it, the narrator described it as being, he sounded genuinely upset and confused. And that frightened me more than anything.
Yeah.
Oh.
There's a couple of, also, I've just thought about going back to the story, there's a couple of bits of interesting foreshadowing. In the introduction, when you were reading about the different people braving the 16th step, it was noticeable to me that most of the reasons behind that were very much male bravado.
Yeah.
And given what's going to happen in the end, that it seems that men are the ones that are daring the step.
Yeah.
So it seems to be...
always showing off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's right. And also, there was a little line we forgot to mention, that when George does the midnight flit, he says, "I'm not stealing from you. I'll come back and I'll pay you."
Yeah.
She says that all my guests pay when they leave. Which is another wonderful little piece of foreshadowing. And it wasn't until I read it the second time I thought, oh, that line sounded vaguely ominous. Now I know why.
Yeah.
So he ushers them out of the bedroom in their nightgowns. And the narrator, of course, is extremely worried about her child. She's worried what George is going to do, but she's also very, very worried what George is going to do to Natalie.
Yeah.
And so he's become this disruptive force. It wasn't enough for him to abuse her, to sexually misuse her. She describes it as doing his business, but we get the idea. It's short, it's perfunctory, and it's not very pleasurable for her. And he's taken away all of her security. She's refound the security, and now he's back to deny even that. And so she's really worried. And so he forces them at knife point down the steps. And Natalie, Mrs. Gallagher, has lit a candle, and she and the narrator are walking ahead of George, who has like a knife at their backs, and the narrator's holding her child. And as they get down to the 14th step, she blows out the candle and she shouts, "Jump!" And this is also a huge leap of faith, because she said, the narrator said, "You can trust me. You can always trust me in what I say." And this is why she's the perfect anti-George in the story. She's everything that George isn't. She can never really trust George to ever come good at anything, but she can trust Natalie. In that moment, she has to take a literal leap of faith. And so she holds her hand, it's in the dark, and they jump, and George, not quite certain what's happening, stumbles down out after them and hits the 16th step, which they will have jumped over and landed on the ground. But George can't get off the 16th step. In fact, he keeps sinking further and further in, and as far as he's concerned, there are steps beneath the step which are steeper and steeper and steeper, in which he's descending. And then Natalie lights the candle again and goes and stands over, and I think you said it was close enough so that if he wanted to, he could bite her ankles.
Yeah. So you got this image, really, that the sort of the floorboards, that he's now submerged in them. So you can only see the top half of his body and the rest of it's underneath, but it's still floorboards. but it isn't. It's like a liquidy feel, but not to anybody else. And he can't stop going forward, and it's now up to his neck, and he's pleading for help. It's not
gets one hand out, but he can't get the other.
And he says, it's the idea is the steps are so steep, and he's going down.
And also, in a matter of minutes, he's gone from being a very brutal male attacker, an invasive force that's come into the home, that's enforced his will upon them through violence and the threat of violence. Yeah. And suddenly, he's a really frightened little boy who's lost his own nightmare. And he's almost looking to his partner or wife, you call, and her landlady, her boss, as a little child. I think at one point you almost describe him as being like a little child, and he's looking, please help me, help. But he can't stop himself descending. The steps get steeper and steeper, and he has to keep going down, and eventually he disappears right through the step. And it's more eerie than we're probably selling it in the way that you write it. Yeah. It's very disturbing, and at the same time, it's ultimately incredibly satisfying.
Yeah, I mean, there's something I want to say here, and this is one of the reasons that I'm really happy that we picked this story, because I love stories like this. And what I mean by that is I love stories where you take one thing and just skew it slightly out. And as you say, I love how you did deliberately downplay it in the introduction. The whole idea of, it's just another step, and it's there, and that's weird, but so what? What do you mean, so what? That's insane. But also you kind of sell it so well in the narration that works. But what I love is that having done that, there's a lot of time, I think a lot of other writers would want to preserve the ambiguity such that you don't get that striking image. But what I love about the way you deliver this story is when you finally do get to that point where he goes to the step. Because there's a version of the story, right, where the light comes back on and he's just disappeared, right?
Yeah.
Like, you could do it that way. But no, you give us the image, he relights a candle, and suddenly he's cut off at the knees in the floorboards, and he can't stop moving forward. And you give us that moment of supreme weirdness.
I really love visual things that are impossible.
Right.
And it's fun, and yet not. I mean, I was very keen. I didn't want him to be in pain.
Right.
I didn't want it to be like he was now burning in acid.
Right.
There is no pain. He's not going to die.
No.
He's going to go down.
Yeah.
And he's not, what I didn't want was a sense that this was now going to be some sort of cheap horror effect. It's just that he's going to be gone.
Yeah.
And do you think there's a reason she lights the candle? Because when the lights are out, the step is only there in the dark.
Yeah.
But she then lights the light, and so she's created this liminal space between dark and light, between fantasy and reality. So he's actually caught.
Well, it's effectively that the step is gone now.
Yeah.
But he's
still trapped there.
He's still trapped there.
Yeah.
And he can only go forward.
Yeah.
And there's a bit earlier on, when you're talking about the other husband, and which again I only noticed because I read it back myself yesterday for the first time in years, and I thought, I know what that means, and it's the bit where Natalie is asked whether her husband is still alive. She said, yes, he might very well be.
He might very well be, that's right.
Because it's no doubt he's also gone down.
Yes.
Because you hear these noises. So it's not that they're going to die down there, it's just that they're there.
Kept out of the way.
They're kept out of the way.
Yeah.
And the brilliant thing about this story is that you're probably guessing we're at the denouement. This is where most of us would have finished the story.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Yeah, it's not what I do.
No.
Really.
And see, that is what makes this story a bit of genius. This is why it kind of like the next 3 pages elevated it in my mind from a really, really good story to something that needs to be in the Ultimate Horror Anthology. Because we then pick up from what's going on from there. And as you say, it's explained to us that Natalie sold up the bed and breakfast that she had with her somewhat disappointing husband and moved. But that particular establishment, as we know, had a 16th step. And for some reason, the step came with her. And so did her husband.
Yeah.
And now, suddenly, if we go right back to the beginning, we remember that guests are often told there are strange noises under the floorboards, particularly in the box room. But that's just wind, or it's just, the steps creaking. Yeah. Perhaps we think it might be rats on the floor, but now we know what was walking around under there.
And you get this bit because she spends the next of her years, of her life with Natalie.
Yeah.
Nothing sexual ever happens. As Natalie is dying, she expresses an urge that she should have done, and Natalie says, well, that would have been nice.
That was such a touching moment.
Really sweet, yeah.
Yeah, I found that quite moving reading it back. I thought, oh, disappointed sex, brilliant. But she can't afford to keep the house. She's been left the money by Natalie, and she moves to another place. And that place has 23 steps, but a 24th on the way down. Because the idea is that you carry them with you.
Yeah.
The house is not haunted. You carry the hauntings of these relationships and the scars that have inflicted upon you, and you're getting rid of them as part of that. And, I'm spoiling it by now. So you begin to realise that there's a reason the story's been told, and the story's now being told to her son.
Yes.
She said, I don't think you care. I mean, you never ask about Natalie, you only ask her about your father, or it's about your father. And I want to say, I don't think you're a bad person as yet, but I know what you've been doing, and what you've been trying with these girls, and maybe that's okay, but just don't be cruel. So, because I don't want this to be what happens to you. Because it could be.
Yeah.
And it's a warning shot to another arrogant, cruel man that she is brought up, and she can't stop being cruel, that he might also be having to be trapped downstairs in this strange nether place.
And then you speak about, and you're always asking about your father. Well, that's under the boards, makers. Yeah. And if it gets too rowdy, just stamp on them. That will shut the bastard up.
That will shut the bastard up, yeah.
Which is the final line of the story, which is just
and that's the end of the story.
Perfection, yeah.
Which is total genius.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful.
It was fun to do. It was great fun to do. And it's, but as I say, it comes out of what always scares me. I mean, I'm always quite scared of horror. I mean, I just always have been. It's just the thing which I'm really bad at gore, so I don't try and write gore very much. What I'm bothered by are things that don't make sense. Things that don't make sense really freak me. And so the idea of just allowing that to be the driving force behind 16th Step and trying to explain away at the beginning this isn't actually a threat means hopefully that when actually you get to the 16th, it's called the 16th Step. And I'm still hoping by the time actually you get, if you set up as some sort of big threat, it's immediately obvious that's what's going to fail George. I'm hoping you've almost forgotten about the staircase thing even being a problem by the time you actually get to the point.
It's not until she says jump and you go, oh my god, is this going to happen? What I think it's going to happen? And it doesn't quite happen the way you expect it to happen.
That's the other thing, yeah.
And it's, you as you say, I kind of expected disappearance. That's where you would go. Or, something quite hideous. He'd be caught in the step
and I didn't want that either.
No, and it was just something really gentle that was highly unnerving. One thing I also love about horror stories too is that sense, as you were saying, of things that don't make sense. It's very much of horror is absurdist fiction, and it's absurdism taken to its absolute nth degree. Yeah. So it becomes intensely unnerving. But then the best horror stories take this absurd, preposterous conceit, which doesn't make any sense, and they build a framework around it of illogic, which doesn't make any sense, but which all connects. So as you say, this step, which for some reason isn't part of a haunted house, the house isn't haunted. You establish right from the word go, this is a ghost story with no ghosts, and inside a house which is not haunted. Yeah. And it's just this strange step. But then the step follows you wherever you go. We don't know how or why, but it makes some kind of like emotional sense that this step would follow you around. And then, of course, it's the fact that having suffered this situation, two women have been through awful situations with disappointing, cruel, abusive men, and as you say, she's about to have raised a third man, and then we go, this is why I'm being told this whole story. And also the great thing about using the first person narration when it's done right is within the story itself, it's explained to us why this story has been rated in the first person.
And because I love first person narration, but it's almost too much of a drug because you can do it, and you don't have to answer this when you do it, but I always think as I'm doing it, who's hearing this?
Yeah, who's this person?
And sometimes you don't need to know, and it doesn't matter, and it's just the readership. But once in a while, you think, I want who it's being read to be, if there is a twist, and I hate that phrase, twist. This is the twist. It's actually this is a warning. This is a revenge tale.
Right.
The revenge is not even necessarily against the husband. It's against the person that we still haven't named, who actually may be the most spiteful and the most dangerous of all. Well, and it has to be a warning to them.
I mean, that's what I wanted to pick up on, because you talked about the genesis of the idea, the weirdness of it, and yes, and I get that, and that's brilliant. But as I say, I mean, the reason for me, what elevates the story above a really good short horror story to one that belongs in the Ultimate Horror Anthology, as Jasper was saying as well, it is what follows after. It's that it doesn't end with the husband going into the floor. And it's because you talked about, when we were talking about Dahl, you said about how you're not a big fan of twists, actually. Right?
No.
But the thing about this one is it's not, the quote-unquote twist is kind of the supernatural moment when the stare reveals what it is and the husband disappears. And it's unquestionably an unexplainable event. It's dramatic, it's horrifying, it's clever, it's emotionally satisfying and scary and all that good stuff. But it's like what follows is what makes the whole, it just gives it this level of profundity, is when you realise, as you say, the whole reason we're hearing this story at all is because we are sitting in the shoes of this son who's following in the footsteps of his father.
It's something that dawned on me when I began doing the short stories a few years ago, whatever it was, having done playwriting and TV, and that's all I did. And then I began writing prose. And you get an idea for a short story, and you'd be building up towards an ending. And the ending, like the husband goes through the floors, and that's the end. And I always found as I got to it, it felt so inevitable and also therefore so predictable.
Right.
That I thought their way of disguising that this is my big climax, this is the twist, to say that's not where the story ends.
Right.
So now what happens? And the aftermath always became more important. It's usually softer, but it's more emotionally fulfilling if you don't say that bit which is the climax is where you end. And I just began finding that tremendously useful. Actually,
right. We've used the term twist, but there's also the term a sting in a tail, and that ending stung for the very reason that you just know. So, and also, I think, this sense, a twist ending doesn't work when it feels too contrived, either when it's come out of the blue or when you feel there's been too much of a deus ex machina, and this is all a bit too. But I think a really good ending is one, and you use the term emotionally satisfying, like this one. That takes you to a different emotional level.
I should probably also, because it's only fair, I should explain the added context of what the story was trying to do, because I wrote a book called We All Hear Stories in the Dark, which is 101 stories as a labyrinth, and the 16th Step is number 16. And the idea of it, what I used to find difficult when I was reading short story anthologies and short story collections, is that the scary ones stopped being scary if you knew they were going to be horror stories. So I thought, I want to do a collection of short stories where you're choosing to follow paths from questions at the end of each story to try and get, as an overarching story, this man has to read the last stories in the world to get his dead wife back. Right. But you go into the stories never knowing whether they're going to be horror stories or not. And sometimes they start as horror stories and then stop being so. Yeah. And I thought that this is, within context, the story actually which says, look, it's a haunted house, but it may not be, and then you smooth it away, could genuinely lead to stories, as elsewhere in the book, where actually it suddenly now is becoming a romantic comedy. Right. Because I quite like the idea of you never really knowing. I always find it very, very difficult. If someone says to you, we'd like you to write a story for our vampire anthology, Fangs in the Night, say, and you just say, well, that's going to be a very obvious twist at the end if I say it's a vampire. So you're trying to find a way around that. And I just thought the idea of, I know that people know me for my short stories as being a bit uncanny, but they're not always horrific. And they're often quite comedic. And it's about the idea of, you feel, it's like going down the steps. You're not sure when you read the next story, when you put your weight on the next story 57, is it going to bite me or not? Because not all of them will.
Right.
And some of them will be very nice, and some of them will only bite you at the last moment.
Yes.
And that makes people feel more unnerved. I think going into horror stories, knowing they're horror stories, always gives you a protective skin. And I quite like the idea of this one potentially biting you because you'd begun to believe it's actually told you at the beginning, I'm not doing that story. That's just a weird quirk, and now we're going to bury it.
Yeah.
Because that would actually fit.
Sure.
So that was part of the fun of it.
I will say as well, sorry, super quick, I will say as well, there is a version of the ending where it's simply that the husband miscounts the steps and breaks his neck. Like, that could be a really mundane.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, you've got that spectrum as well. So, I mean, that's in the mix, right, as one of the possibilities.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I quite like George. I mean, he says what's awful.
Really?
Yeah, I wrote this abusive guy, but knowing he was somebody who spends most of the story wanting to believe he's an... Because that's what abusive people are like. That's what most people are like. He wants to believe, actually, that he is charming, but he has his moments.
Yeah.
He doesn't know he's going to kill Natalie or not, but he probably will.
Yeah.
And he probably will do terrible things. But you put up with abuse because of the 95% of the time when actually what they're delivering feels like you can accept it. And I feel that he's an acceptable man. I mean, I find that that's what's so awful about George, is that it's very hard to write villains that you actually believe that the people might want to stay with. He's a dangerous bastard, George.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it's the fact as well. Also, you précis his introduction with the fact that your father wasn't a good man, but he wasn't a bad one.
Yeah.
And again, I think most of us have to admit that we are neither good nor bad. And can I say also one of the reasons as well? I think you achieve what you set out to do with the story is because of the tone and the prose. And again, one of the things that Kit and I were saying about the prose, because we've read it so close to Pig, was that we were noticing there is an elegance and a simplicity about Dahl's language, which we both know as writers is incredibly hard to actually achieve.
Yeah.
It's so much easier to write convoluted sentences laden down with similes and metaphors than it is to get straight to the point so simply and elegantly, and it's almost in some ways like you picked up the torch that Dahl put down and carried on, because your prose is not the same, not similar, not even as an influence, but it does the same thing that Dahl's does.
Thank you. I mean, it comes from my theatre background. I try and write things conversationally. I think on the page I can do flowing sentences, but only because it's someone chatting. And I hope that therefore it feels quite readable.
Very.
Because that's the fun.
It could be a theatre piece. You could have that as a I think you probably do. Three actors, but an individual narrator who would be talking to the audience, and then and it would
perhaps
it would work really, really well. I think simply, and you wouldn't have to do anything, I think, to it other than just add a few stage directions.
That's interesting. Because there has been talk. I mean, people have approached me before about adapting some of the. And I've written some stories which lend themselves very, very naturally. There's a story called George Clooney's Moustache, which is pretty much a performance piece, which is quite funny but quite bleak in its own way. And I was wondering whether there might be other things I could do. So I might consider. I could see an edited version of this maybe working as a performance piece, but we'll see. Yeah. Fortunately, not by me, which is always better. But
So, thanks so much for talking to us about the story. We've got about 10 minutes or so. I do want to throw the floor open. Thanks so much for sticking with us. Any questions you've got for Rob, either about the 16th Step or about his short stories in general? Yeah, please go ahead.
You say that you get unnerved by things that don't make sense.
Yes.
So, do things like the art of people like Escher scare you? Because obviously they're patterns that look like they work but don't. I
mean, scared is too strong a word. But I'm intrigued by them. I remember when I was a kid, you constantly follow it. Other people would say, yes, that's a very, very clever technique. I would still want to go up and down stairs, and I still find it quite hypnotic.
Did you do it with your fingers?
Yeah,
I used to do that.
Yeah. So that's what I love. Actually, is the way that the world. But we know that anyway. The world is not what we think it is. It's only the perception we have of it, and that's becoming increasingly clear through science. I've just been working on a show for Apple, which is all about quantum physics and the drama. And you're aware that it's those little things, so people get trapped in a slightly altered parallel world, but it's not like evil world. It's a world where your car's a different colour. And that's enough to sort of set you down a path and say, but I know my car was red. I mean, everything else seems the same, but the car is now blue. And those things are things actually which I think come back to bite you. And the way in which after a while, and we do it, that after a while, if enough people say to you, your car has always been blue, you'll say, all right, I suppose it was a mental glitch, even though you know deep down that what you know is true. You do rewrite history. All of us, we do it all the time. If people tell us back a conversation we had them years ago, and everyone agrees that that's what we did, and you know that's not what happened.
Yeah.
You say, well, for the sake of sanity, I will revise what I know didn't happen into something, or vice versa. So yeah, I mean, the world is a very. I find it full of in a state of flux all the time. Really.
It makes me think about the Mandela effect as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the flip side of the same coin, right? Where it's like you're convinced of something that's happened and it hasn't, right?
Yeah. And after a while, you might as well have done.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's what everyone believes.
If I could also mention the great Rod Serling, the genius of most of the Twilight Zone episodes is that you have an everyday Joe. One tiny little thing happens which alters reality for him, but for nobody else. Yeah. And they suddenly find themselves completely on the outside of the situation.
Yeah.
And it's a little thing. It's a fortune telling machine. In an old diner, or a printer's devil, which is printing.
Whereas I quite like playing with the idea of something like that happening, but it changes for everybody. But only one person cares.
Only one person notices.
So what you do is you'll say things like, "Okay, well, on the news this morning, Luxembourg's vanished." And no one minds. It's only a small country. But this one woman says, "But my husband went on a business trip there. Is he dead or not?" And it's a story, therefore, about do I grieve or not?
Right.
With this absurdist thing that no one else seems to be bothered about. Or a story in which everybody in the world suddenly receives letters in the post explaining, to take all the pressure off when and how you'll die. So you haven't actually got to worry about it any longer. And this one guy in the post doesn't get his. So he's the only person left in the world with the ambiguity of it, which people think that he's hiding from them. And he starts to... And so it's the idea for me, it's the insanity of the world is you set one thing going wrong and everybody but you buys it, which I think would be what would happen. I always think that if suddenly something really, really fundamentally weird happened, I know I'd be left on the outside saying, why have we all gone black and white? And they'd say, what do you mean? It's always been like this. I'm sure we had colour yesterday. What's colour?
That's actually the start of my trilogy.
Really?
Like that.
Oh, good.
The whole world changes and one character notices the difference and she can't accept it.
Yeah. Because it is possible that's happening every day. And we just go along with it without realising it. Maybe Derby wasn't here yesterday, but we all now collectively believe it was.
I've certainly never been before.
Well, I don't know. I mean, for me, I think you said it, in the start of the first show about how you watch quite a lot. I mean, that's how I feel watching politics these days. And genuinely, I mean, I'm not going to start the debate, but genuinely, I just watch Newsnight, and I'm just like, I don't. Am I an alien? I do not understand what's going on.
I spent so many years believing in, not for British as well, but what the West Wing taught me about, basically about what was at stake. Or even things like Yes Minister.
Yeah, right.
Where you would say, they care that this doesn't happen because this could topple the government. No, it doesn't.
No.
Nothing, it doesn't matter. People just say, no, it's on record, don't care.
Yeah.
We can see you on video saying this. No, I didn't. And if you just say no enough, people eventually get tired of telling you. And they say, as I was saying about the Escher thing, really.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, after a while, you just say, okay, it's easier simply not to bring up the fact that we all saw you do this. If you just keep on saying, it wasn't me, eventually they say, fine, we'll move on.
Isn't that the cheating husband who's been caught out? Defense, that wasn't me.
Well, I've been cheating on my wife a lot more often. Realising it doesn't matter
since Brexit, okay.
I'm doing it in front of her half the time.
This is on record.
She doesn't ever, because I just say, no, it's not happening. I always gaslight her and she always goes along with it.
Did you just say you've been in Luxembourg?
I just have been in Luxembourg. Or indeed, sometimes I go for Andorra sometimes as well, because that's even smaller.
Does this not all sort of connect back to Pig as well, though? The idea that they're all queued up.
Can you say that again?
Thanks. Does this not all sort of connect back to Pig as well, where they're all lined up?
Yeah.
And this stuff is happening to them, and we as the reader can see
Yeah.
the horror
Yes.
of what's going on. We're on the outside.
It's people joining a queue to die.
Yeah, these are people who are going into the industrialised meat grinder that might be modern society, the labour culture,
Capitalism. Just throwing it out there.
But it's always it's always what's really bothered me is that fiction always paints a picture of somebody eventually being a rebel, and I know in real life I will just sit there and just say no. If a bus was going off a cliff, I would be the one saying, I just think we should sit down and wait for this to resolve. When you watch the Poseidon Adventure, and at the beginning, or at the base, and the only way out is if some of them climb the Christmas tree and start making their way up through the ship. And, and everyone says, no, don't do that. And I would be very much saying, look, I'm staying with the buffet. I don't care. Someone will resolve this sooner or later, and I would drown. And that would be me. And yet, as fiction writers, we're being the rebels. Yeah. So I'm always feeling that there's a danger when I'm writing that I'm telling an untruth about myself because I want to be someone who is furious about aspects of the world, and yet I'm aware that I just go along with it. That there are things which really anger me about Britain and the world generally, and yet for the sake of just peace of mind, because actually I'd much rather selfishly be writing my silly stories, I won't actually protest. I'll just say, oh, I'm sure someone else will put this right eventually. Things must be getting better, even though they're obviously not. So, yeah, terrible.
It's very interesting. I'm just thinking about how my next novel is going to be covering a lot of that territory. It's really interesting.
It's a weird time, isn't it?
Very strange time. Yeah. Very, very strange time. Good time for strange stories, though, for sure.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the floor? We've got another couple of minutes, I think. Any last question from anyone? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just curious if you've been inspired by any other short story writers outside of horror.
Yeah, pretty much. The short stories I generally read are not horror stories. So, I find that, Joyce Carol Oates is a good example, who plays around with so many different forms. My biggest influences when I fell in love with short stories when I was about a teenager, and I was reading mostly at that time Saki, who did write some uncanny stories, but they're mostly very, very funny, Noel Coward-like stories. There's a great story called Tobamori it's very, very funny, about a dinner party where there's suddenly a cat that reveals it can actually talk. And it talks in this languorous Noel Coward-like way, insisting, and makes it clear that it knows who's been having an affair with who. So they hang it, which is bizarre. It's great. It's a very, very funny story. I also love Guy de Maupassant. I love the French stories. He's a 19th century writer. Again, I nearly chose that for my story, actually, because he wrote one story which is utterly mad, called La Ola, which is about a man convinced he's being followed around by another version of himself, and eventually sets fire to his own house and kills all of his servants to try and escape it. But most of his stories aren't weird, and they're beautiful, and they're dramatic, and they were a massive influence on me. Chekhov. There are so many... The great short story writers aren't necessarily leaning into horror, although there's always an aspect of it, because I think that short stories in themselves are fundamentally weird, because all of them are so forensically looking at one small thing. I remember being very, very bothered. It's a silly story, I'll tell you very, very quickly. When I was a kid, I remember reading a really terrible short story in a woman's magazine that my mum had about a woman who was being told that she had to prepare dinner for her husband coming home that evening with his boss and the wife. And she has to go out and have a hairdo. It gets caught in the rain and the hairdo is ruined. And then the wife of the boss also has her hairdo ruined in the same rain, and that's how they all bond. That's the story. And I remember saying to my mum, what happens next? She said, no, that is the story, and it's very funny. And I remember having this, it's a real conscious thing. I thought there's a sudden moment of absolute existential dread. This woman was created for that story and nothing else. So that means this is the most important thing that's ever happened to her, was this. The rest of her life is comparatively minor to the events of this. And so with short stories, I always feel as I'm reading, whatever they are, this is chosen to be the descriptor of these characters' entire lives is this. And that's so uncanny going into it. If you have a story about people talking brokenly over a dinner party, this sums them up. This is who they are. That is horrific. So I find all short story fiction in themselves naturally is weird and unsettling because the emphasis is so wrong. Novels relax you. Novels are long enough that people have proper lives. Short stories say, this is all they are. This is all they can ever be. This sums them up. I find that terrifying. So I find all short stories in their own way reveal something very interesting.
That's quite fascinating. There's a wonderful quote from Ballard when he was talking about short stories, when he was saying the novel in and of itself is an incomplete and imperfect form.
Yeah.
You can never write a perfect novel. It's pretty much impossible. But you can write a perfect short story. And I think Ballard's written a few perfect short stories.
Yeah.
I think Bradbury has as well.
Yeah.
But does that also mean that perfection in and of itself is quite a horrifying thing? It's something quite frightening.
Yes. And, it's when, people will talk about, it's ascribed to Hemingway, the perfect short story is that 6-word short story about
one pair of baby shoes.
Baby shoes for sale, never worn.
Yeah.
And you think, and then you think of that, and then you start saying, it's not that great a short story. It's 6 words, and yes, it's economical. And of course, we always talk about with poetry and with short story writing the whole praise of economy.
Yeah.
And yet that can give it some sort of perfection, but it also gives it. I mean, I love short story writing, but I'm also aware at the same time there's something very, very hermetically sealed about them, and that can be a bad thing, which means that they're not perfect. And there's something also quite... I shouldn't say... I write short stories all the time. I love it. It's my favourite form. They can be quite smug in their knowing that they're short stories. And I know I can be very smug. I can say, well, I think this is a very, very well-crafted 7,000 words there. Not a word wasted. And you just think, oh, come on. Because actually the best bits sometimes of novels are the bits which are wandering off.
Yeah,
suddenly.
absolutely.
It's one of the reasons I like Pig is that although it does feel... word by word chosen, it also feels freewheeling and disparate.
Yeah.
And I like to give the impression that short stories ought not to be... If you read guidebooks to short story writing, and they always say, just cut back everything that you think is extraneous. I like extraneous as well.
Yeah.
I think extraneous can be brilliant and fun. And I taught for a while at a place where they said, we will never allow a single adjective or adverb. And I thought, well, I know that they're things that you can overuse, but they're just words, and they can be good to use them.
Yeah.
And it's annoying to be told there are certain rules you have to work by. And with short story writing in particular, people can be really harsh about short story writing, because, we all live in the shadow of the American thing where it began to be extremely concise. I quite like flabby writing. I'm a flabby person in many ways.
Well, on that bombshell, we are reaching for time now. Rob, thank you so much for agreeing to join us.
Thank you. It was an honour, genuinely.
Our first guest on the Ultimate Horror Anthology, and particularly thank you for telling us that all short stories are effectively horror stories, because that means that we're never going to run out of material. So that's really
excellent.
Good.
Yeah.
You've expanded the range of what we're going to be covering. Everyone, thanks for joining us. Obviously, it's great to see you all. The Ultimate Horror Anthology is available pretty much whatever podcast can be downloaded. We've got the first 3 episodes that are already up and running. Obviously, this will be the season finale for season 1. But if you want to hear podcasts about what we've got so far, Brian Lumley's The Viaduct. We've got In the Hills of Cities by Clive Barker. A couple of Stephen King's coming your way very soon. The Raft and Fair Extension. And loads and loads of other people.
Robert Bloch.
We've got Bloch, that Hellbound Train is already out, and loads more. And obviously, we'll cut this into 2 parts for the season finale. Season 2, I think we're hoping to get more guests on. That's the idea. We'll have some editors, publishers, and also authors to talk about their work. So check out Ultimate Horror Anthology wherever you download a podcast. Thanks so much for joining us today. And one more time, please, huge round of applause for Rob Shearman. Amazing guest. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Just before we go as well, can I ask you to give one last round of applause to Ronnie, not only for putting up with me for over 3 decades, more than a life sentence, but for leaping into the fold here, although she's not a technician, for helping us do all the recording.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Ultimate Horror Anthology. If you've enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe on whatever platform you heard it on. If you had a really good time, we'd love it if you could also leave a review, as that will definitely help more listeners find the show. You can also email us at ultimatehorroranthology@gmail.com and follow us on Twitter at UHA Pod. If you'd like to support the show financially in return for early access, exclusive content, and much, much more, please visit patreon.com/Ultimate Horror Anthology. See you there.